Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Great Resignation or the Great Rethink digital event hosted by the CCMI West Midlands and Northwest Regional Board. My name is Michael Bolt and I'm an Events Delivery Manager at CCMI, and I'll shortly be handing over to Professor Dilshad Sheikh, who will introduce today's speaker. If you have any questions during this digital event, you can ask them using the live chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. Today's session is being recorded and will be shared with you later today for those of you who have booked to attend. And the event recording will also be available on the CCMI website and the CCMI YouTube channel. So now, without any further delay, over to Dilshad to begin today's event.
Good evening, everybody. I hope that you've had a good Monday. You must be thinking, phew, the first day of the week is over. Hopefully you're in for a treat tonight. And what I'd like to do is introduce our very special guest today, who is an absolute expert as far as the Great Resignation is concerned. So let me have the honour and privilege of introducing you to Chris Roebuck, who's a chartered companion of the CCMI and also a fellow of the CCIPD. He's also an honorary visiting professor at Bayes Business School. He's one of HR's most influential thinkers and a top 40 global organizational culture expert as an executive mentor. And then last but not least, he's been interviewed over 350 times on TV. I was wondering, can we count this as 351? Because it's kind of on the screen. And he was quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and other top publications. So thank you, Chris. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to sincerely thank you for taking time out to join this event and listen to my insights on the Great Resignation, or whatever you want to call it. It's about how we can move forwards from where we are now, which allows you and your organizations to be truly successful by having inspired, motivated, and high-performing people. What's really important for me, though, is so that after this event, you are able to be more successful. So what I'd like you to do is, as I'm going through this, just to take a few notes and identify 3 simple actions that you can take afterwards based on my ideas and questions and perhaps other things that will enable you to be more effective and your organization to be more effective. So all of us have moved from the pre-COVID world through COVID and into the world we're in now. And those experiences have impacted all of us in some way. Now, for some of you listening, these will have been truly life-changing and potentially tragic. And certainly for those of you who have lost friends or family or colleagues, I'll just say now my thoughts are with you, as they are for any of you who are still suffering, for example, via long COVID. All of us have had different experiences, and we look at COVID through that lens. The same applies to organizations and what's happened to them. But I think it's really useful for all of us to be able to see this big picture and understand that experiences have been very different for different people and different organizations, because that understanding gives us the capability to understand others better, their perspectives, their needs, and beat this challenge of where we are now and how we can be better together across our organizations. So to understand where we are and how to move forward, I'd like to look at the underlying causes of what we call the Great Resignation. First, I'd like to focus on the critical point of what was the impact of COVID on people and organizations? What happened to people and organizations at that point of reopening, the Great Resignation trigger point, and then look at what was the impact, what's happened since. Now we're in the world we're in, what do we need to do about it, and what the future might hold? The fundamental change I believe that COVID caused was that before COVID, we just thought about organizations in terms of what they delivered. But COVID made us view organizations through the lens of if people's jobs were at high risk of transmission. And that also explains the impact on organizations. This impact across sectors was vastly different. Now, the slide that you can see now on risk factors in different sectors makes this absolutely clear, both in terms of the size of the sector's workforce, the percentage of jobs at risk, and the percentage of workers who were furloughed. The percentage of jobs at risk directly relates to the identified number of people in high transmission roles. Now, as you can quite clearly see at the top, as an example, we have accommodation and food services. Now this is April 20, 68% of jobs at risk and already 73% furloughed. But in contrast, much further down towards the bottom, we have information and communication with only 8% at risk. So effectively, the impact on any specific sector was a function of the percentage of people in high-risk jobs. But it wasn't also evenly distributed in other senses. The heaviest impact fell on those on low pay. For example, 50% of those with pay at less than £10 an hour were at risk of loss of their job, but professional occupations who were paid £25 or more were only at 2% risk. But to make it easier to understand this big picture, I'm going to focus on 4 key groups that COVID created. Now, each of these groups of people experienced significantly different things, potentially even within the same organization, and that's impacted their attitude to the Great Resignation and their role in creating it. The first group was those who were able to continue working. As of April 20, about 14–15% of the working population. This group continued working with adaption to reduce COVID risk, so didn't really experience the dramatic change in their working lives as other groups did. However, with all the other groups, they weren't able to move jobs. So the turnover in that sector was significantly reduced. But certainly for individuals, COVID may have had a significant impact in their personal lives that then impacted their work life. The next group is those who weren't able to work or who are furloughed and unemployed. Now, as of April 20, that was 22% furloughed, 5% unemployed. Essentially, these people had jobs that were high transmission risk, and their sectors were effectively closed down, e.g. accommodation and food services. But because of the sectors they were in, the burden of this mostly fell on low-paid people, particularly young people. And there were those who were able to go off and remote. Now, that's about 20% of the working population and subsequently increased. But too often we forget that about 60% of people cannot work remotely. And the ability to do so, even in the 40% who can, aren't spread equally across the country. So if you take, for example, the OECD data, that shows that whilst 55% of jobs in London can be done remotely, only 35% in the northeast of England. And those figures are still relevant to where we are now. So this also meant that more people in poorer areas were unable to remote as well. When we talk about remote, it's also worth remembering that this isn't just an office-based service organization that goes remote. It's also the office-based employees of organizations who were able to continue in some way. Final group is our essential workers, those who had to work on despite being in high-risk roles. That was essentially 17%. As we know, this group courageously carried on despite personal risk, and many suffered illness and fatalities as a result. And certainly I would like to thank any of you listening who are essential workers for everything you did and you sacrificed for the rest of us. So that's where the people were. But which organizations were more likely to survive through COVID? As we've seen, all organizations had to adapt, but the level of adaptation required significantly varied amounts of effort. And to be blunt, if you get closed down, you can't adapt anyway. But having said that, there were some really entrepreneurial organizations who found something else they could do. In terms of whether you could survive as an organization through COVID, it's worth remembering that SMEs employ 2/3 of UK workers. And an SME's ability to weather business disruption financially is much less than larger organizations. So what were the three key factors that I think helped organizations get through COVID? The next slide shows what I believe they are. First of all, it's about assess. The ability of the organization, particularly C-suite, to assess the challenge and the situation they were in, and to recognize what they needed to do to deal with the coming problem. It was then about adapting. Was it possible? Was it practical to implement those changes? Could clear leadership from C-suite and other leaders be successful? For many organizations, we all saw the heroic response at the beginning of the first phase of COVID. And that depended on there being a reserve of trust that had been built up between leaders and their people. But it wasn't just about that leadership element. It was about the whole way the organization worked, about making decision-making processes slick and agile, cascading decision-making, giving people more freedom to act. And that thinking even enabled organizations whose markets closed down to improvise. I mean, I can think of a small engineering company whose products to other sectors were no longer in demand. They started to produce gym weights for the massive rise in home exercise equipment. I mean, how cool is that? Small retail moved online. So there was some great inspiring entrepreneurial thinking in that adaption phase. And then it was about accelerating, to go up a gear in terms of enabling that adaption and delivery to keep going. Because at the beginning, we all thought COVID was going to be over quickly. We thought it was going to be a sprint, when in fact it became a marathon. And I believe that those three principles of assess, adapt, and accelerate still apply to the current dynamic world. So that was COVID. Well, let's now move to reopening. And let's look at what people in these different groups had experienced just before that happened. So this is the underlying foundation for the Great Resignation. And we'll also look at how organizational responses played into that. So let's go back to our four groups. So those who were able to continue working, so they weathered the pandemic pretty well, especially, and actually in a positive way, if they were in areas such as online sales and distribution, and medical testing, who did actually very well for obvious reasons. But even so, everyone had pretty much been locked into their jobs for 2 years. And even if the pandemic hadn't seriously affected them at work, they probably reprioritized what they thought was important into their lives due to personal experiences. Now then we have the next group who were the unable to work and furloughed. Obviously they had time on their hands. And for those who'd spent their time thinking about what they really wanted to do next and planning for it, this was the time to activate the great plan. Would they return? Would they not return? Would they go back and see if the job still lived up to their expectations? And it's this group that was one of the biggest drivers of the Great Resignation, or certainly what I would call the great non-return as well for some of them. What about the remote workers? Well, probably in general terms positive. Able to spend more time with family, but also for others, there's evidence that a few people felt disconnected from the organization and somewhat lonely. Now, again, that's a leadership issue, an organizational issue, more than a personal issue. But every person's experiences then fed into the responses in terms of who wants to go back into the office and how regularly. Finally, those who've been in those high-risk roles are essential workers. I suppose for them, I'd say that reopening was a sign that perhaps their jobs might no longer be as dangerous. And it also meant that there was at last an opportunity after 2 years of danger and exhaustion, to have an opportunity for recuperation, or maybe even change jobs completely. On the organizational side, it meant very different things depending what organizations have been doing. For those that had been running still, it was now, okay, here we go, quickly back to business. It's about quickly getting people back into the office. How do we move from remote to hybrid or whatever? For those who closed down, it was, oh, great, we can go back to work. Sorry, if they had survived. But if we're going back to work, we need to get all of our people in very, very quickly. Or if they don't want to come back, we need to find some more. And for essential workers, it was about how are we going to support our people going forwards, bearing in mind what they have suffered with exhaustion and potentially mental health issues. So to some degree, that's a bit of a negative and tragic picture in some way, and it was in some way. But sometimes I'm asked if maybe there were things that were beneficial that came out of COVID. And I suppose I'd pick up on 4. Hybrid working. COVID definitely forced the adoption of remote or hybrid working, probably by at least 5 to 10 years. And I think you can view that as something that is positive in that it gives people an opportunity to make a choice, to have a better quality of working life and flexibility in their lives. There's also something about decision making and agility. I think that COVID forced people to realize that decision making processes were to some degree slow and bureaucratic, and survival meant that you had to cascade decision making to the lowest possible level to be slick, to be effective, and that actually that worked quite well, and that it's a good thing to carry it forwards. That said, I've heard from people that some organizations, despite that lesson, have actually tried to go backwards to the old world. It's also about leadership. I think that COVID, because we needed to change so much so rapidly in so many organizations through something that had never happened before, it demanded that leaders step up. And the fact that it lasted so long meant that they had to do so consistently. And many, I've heard from many organizations that what those first 6 to 8 weeks of COVID did was to show employees who the true leaders were in their organization. So then we have the power of people. And I think COVID showed, perhaps in a way that's not often seen or not been seen before in the military or other than in the military or emergency services, that if you have great leadership, if you have a clear purpose, if you have dedicated people, it's possible to achieve so much more than we can even imagine in normal circumstances. So that was the sort of background and picture. I think given this environment, people looking at their return to work were mulling over some key factors in their minds when thinking, okay, so what's my next move in relation to my working life? And I think some of these are on the next slide, and I'll just run briefly through those. COVID reprioritization. I genuinely believe that everyone who is listening has changed their view of what's important in their lives since we started this COVID journey. I certainly have. And I think I don't even need to present evidence. I just think from the experiences that we've had ourselves, our conversations with our friends, our families, we know that we've reprioritized the value of our whole lives, our free time, more against work than we did before. Some of us have realized that if we get lost in ambition at work, we actually miss out on life. So that realization has meant that virtually for everybody, work now has to meet higher expectations than before. But as we'll see, for some more than others. Expectations of leadership. One of the things I've consistently heard from people in organizations is that they realized who the good leaders were. But if we look at that, there's quite clear evidence that people were not getting the quality of leadership they expected. And as a result of that, employee engagement, having been going up for the previous 10 years, dropped globally. In the US, it dropped by 4%, as the next slide shows. So something was going on. People weren't getting what they wanted from their leaders over the pandemic. And to be honest, maybe I shouldn't mention this, but to be honest, Gallup's regional analysis put UK engagement in 2021 at 11%. Now, I'm not necessarily that pessimistic, but in reality, whether you go for the 11% or 32%, it's still not brilliant. And then I think what was going through people's minds was, oh, hey, hang on, I'm now out of this job lockdown. I can move jobs. And so it meant that there was literally the whole working population suddenly had the possibility to move jobs, which created the flood. The needing the break. Let's be honest, COVID was tiring, COVID was stressful. And we didn't only have to worry about work, even if we still were in a job. We also had to worry about the health of ourselves, our families, particularly if we had high-risk family members. And for those not in work, it was about financial survival. Then, of course, we had those in the essential services who were utterly exhausted and asking that question, I just need some time off to recover. And the subsequent impact on those essential services in terms of resignation, attrition was really high. Remote realization was people saying, you know, this remote working, it's actually quite cool. I've got a better life balance. Now, irrespective of what Alan Sugar and Jacob Rees-Mogg think, the evidence is that if it's set up right, people perform better at home. You know, if you look at studies from, well, if we just take three, American Express, Compaq, JD Edwards, all said that their people worked more effectively at home between 15 and 40%. And people say, why? I don't think the answer is necessarily that complex, in that if we're actually in a busy office, we're more likely to be disturbed or distracted when working. And the neuroscience says quite clearly, if that happens, it takes 20 minutes to get our concentration back. And as a result of that, the speed and quality of work goes down. But remote working was by no means perfect, as I've alluded to. Interestingly, the recorded drop in engagement recorded by Gallup was higher for remote workers than it was for those that were still in the office, because they said the lack of connection with their organizational purpose, the expectation of support and development were not met. And as I said before, some felt lonely. And again, that's back to the leadership challenge. But certainly where it was implemented well, we know it improved performance. We know it actually also reduced burnout and helped retain staff. Finally, it's jobless realization. Those who've been on furlough suddenly thought, wow, there are actually things you can do with a lot of time that add value to your life. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit less pay and a little bit more time for myself might be a better return on investment for my life. And that was particularly valid for dual income families. So if those thoughts were going through people's minds, then you add on top of that sectors reopening that had been closed, needing lots of people very quickly, significant increase in the online ability to access job opportunities, more organizations being set up for remote working, then people had some really interesting and empowering decisions to make. And what they probably were going to do is predictable. Even though perhaps those decisions were made on just personal perspectives and were significantly driven by emotional responses to what they'd experienced. But then again, to be honest, we often make our decisions on our emotional feelings at the time and then try and rationalize it post-event. So that's where we were on the cusp of the Great Resignation. What happened next? Let's have a quick break and discuss all of this and see what happened next.
Thank you, Chris. Really interesting. And of course, in terms of talent acquisition and retaining talent, I'm just waiting for some questions to come through, but I'm quite interested, and I'm sure the managers and leaders in the audience will be as well. What can managers and leaders do to retain talent? So given the scenarios you've just taken us through, the different type of individual worker, in your expert opinion, what can we do? What should we be doing to try and keep hold of the best talent that we have within our organizations?
Okay, one of the things is, I would say at the start, the organizations aren't necessarily always good at accurately identifying who the true talent is, but we'll leave that for another webinar. There's certain elements that are predictable and consistent about what you need to do so people feel they are valued, want to give their best, that apply, as we'll hear in the next section, essentially to any human being, the things we want from life, the things we want from work. Then it's a case of, given those basics that everybody wants, how can we fine-tune the delivery of that in a way that is the needs of this particular individual? And that is about knowing your people. That's about understanding what they want. And whilst there are things that everybody wants from their job and out of their work, it's about, does this individual have a family, need to collect the children from school? Do they want to have some form of further education? And all of those little questions that a good leader should be asking people on a day-to-day basis, or gather a picture about that person as they go through, giving day-to-day feedback, having regular meetings with that person, asking them how they're doing.
No, brilliant.
So consistent for everybody. This is what people need to be inspired to do their job well, fine-tuning it for the individual.
No, perfect, great. And it's quite an interesting question that Paul Bevan has posted. So he thinks your talk is great, so well done. Paul's interested in how much of the shift of people was just the opening of the floodgates to an existing desire for flexible working practices, which employers had not wanted to unleash. And I can actually, with my academic background, I actually think that's true, because I've worked in institutions where if you're not teaching, you still had to go in. And, you know, the academics were thinking, hang on a minute, I'm not teaching today. In fact, I'm not teaching tomorrow. Can I work from home? And we were told no, because productivity is going to be affected. So really interested to hear a response to that question.
Sorry, it just poses, sorry, I'm laughing. It just poses the question, how many business schools who should know the research on the improvement of performance with home working made their staff come in? Sorry, that was just, but seriously, you know, I think it's absolutely clear that it's a range of circumstances. Yes, without doubt, the technology was there prior to COVID if organizations had wanted to do it to allow more people to remote work. In my experience in international banking, I was able to remote work across the world back in 2003, 2004. Now, therefore, I believe an element of that was a fundamental mistrust by leaders, excuse me, of their people. The assumption that if they're not in the office working, they're sitting in the garden sunbathing and they're not working. And I think that basic mistrust of your own employees, you know, sends a message about how good your organization is. If you then take, you know, what Paul mentioned, then suddenly, bang, as we reopened, everybody was trying to recruit from the sectors that were closed down urgently. And you put those two together, and not only that, but also obviously the sectors that were still working, because the rest of the economy was opening up as well, they were also recruiting as well. Then there was just this flood. But the beauty of, I think the beauty of what happened was that the enforced creation of opportunities to remote work then meant that employers could no longer say it doesn't work. And the fact that they needed people who said they wanted to remote work meant that they couldn't get out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got another one here for you as well. So it's kind of a very strong statement. So I just want your opinion.
I like strong statements. Go for it.
So this is from Diary Detox, and they're suggesting managers should spend more time with their people, talking with them about how they're doing instead of what they are doing. So I think that leads from my question about if you're working from home, management leaders, they get suspicious that you're not doing anything. So what do you think of that? Managers should spend more time with their people, talking with them about how they're doing, obviously mental health, what have you, well-being, instead of what they are doing.
I mean, I think I don't want to give an impression that, in general terms, I'm saying that most leaders distrust their people. I think that is not true in 2022. I think that there are some toxic leaders out there who don't trust their people. And the sooner those people are weeded out, the better for everybody. In terms of the how, as much as the what, to be honest, any organization that is looking at people's performance should be looking at the how as well as the what. One of the things, even back in the early 2000s, when I was global head of leadership at UBS, the fundamental question on performance appraisals was not just the what, it was the how. Because we wanted to know that people were delivering in line with the organization's values. And we made it clear, because bottom line, you can intimidate people into performance for a few months, maybe a year, but you can inspire them for years. Mm-hmm. And what we noticed was that certain people were getting performance through intimidation. And it was made absolutely clear that if performance was delivered without the how, without sticking to the organization's values, they weren't going to get their bonus. And you have to be ruthless on that. And I think that's a great question, because every organization listening should be asking the how as much as the what.
Brilliant. And well done to Diary Detox. Got another question for you here from Liz Rushton. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. You mentioned earlier on during your discussion about the effects of COVID on different groups. What information do you have on the effects split by gender? So with all the, your expertise, your knowledge, your experience, is there a difference with gender?
Yes, without doubt, because if you look at the demographics of people in low-paid jobs, part-time jobs, it's primarily women. If you look at what happened if there were dual income families with obviously schools closing down, it was in most cases the wife who had to give up her job. Yeah. Although, due credit, there were guys who gave up their jobs, and well done on them. Bottom line is, if you look at all the statistics, women were impacted more than men, more detrimentally than men through COVID. Full stop.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then another really interesting question posted by Developing Business Excellence Limited. Quite relevant. So the economic outlook for the UK is poor, and yet one of our key strengths is the willingness of leaders to empower their staff. Why are other less trusting economies managing better than us? So your thoughts around that?
I mean, we're now talking about economics, and you get to the point, as we all know, about what your wage levels are, and the simple principle that if you're operating in a low wage economy, if you are competing with another organization in a high wage economy on a similar product, you have a price advantage. And that said, if you're in an economy that is not based on the development of simple products, then you have an advantage in terms of the quality of service, et cetera, et cetera. But that's an interesting point, because if you look at the global impact of COVID in terms of GDP and other things, what's really interesting is that the developed economies that were more away from the simple, practical creation of products, for example, like a significant proportion of the economies in India, Bangladesh, et cetera, those economies had to close down more because more people were doing things that couldn't be done within the COVID risk. So the hit to those lower skills economies was significant. I mean, what was it? Mexico, unemployment in certain places was well over 30%.
Yeah.
Whereas in UK, it only got to 5%. In US, it only got to a similar figure. So, yeah, it is difficult to compete. But if you're competing on the right thing, in the final analysis, sustainable profitability, if you're inspiring your people, it's going to produce that.
Yeah, brilliant. And then we have a question from Sarah Cooley. So she's asking, how can you increase the social element and the collaboration between team members when they don't physically get to see each other now that they are remote working? Because again, certainly from my experience, again, in the HE, higher education sector, quite a few lecturers, support staff, professional staff were resigning because of that lack of social interaction. So again, what do you think?
It's, you know, the remote working. I was going to cover this a bit later, but I'll zoom through it when I get to it. The remote working thing is a double-edged sword, without a doubt. And remote working, remote working is not for everybody. Remote working is not for every job. Remote working needs to be a balance between the individual and their wishes, the requirements of the job, and the requirements of the team. Now, if you're in an environment where, for example, someone is developing software, you can just say, right, go off, develop the software, and when it's done, come back. Because that's all they do. If you have an organization where you have a team that has to collaborate, has to meet, has to talk to produce whatever needs to be produced, you can't let everybody be remote all the time. So depending what you're doing, there has to be a balance that says, look, and I think it's my gut thought when I'm asked this question is to say, I think people should come into the office probably for a day a week to maintain team integrity, to have that social contact, etc., etc. So the balance has to be, it's also about what work you're doing. So even if you're in one particular job, there is work that you will be doing as part of that job that requires collaboration with other team members. Now, you might be able to do that remotely, but if you're doing brainstorming and that sort of stuff, you need to be in the office. Equally, if you have a report to do, a big project, a piece of work that needs peace, quiet, and no disturbance, then it makes sense to do it at home if you've managed to train the children and the dog not to disturb you.
Fair comment. Yeah. Okay. So, Chris, what we'll do, we'll go back to you and then we'll come back to some more questions, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's crack on. So, how did the problem manifest itself? Well, if you take CIPD data, resignations were up 40% on pre-pandemic level. Now, that implies there's a lot of people not doing anything. But if you dig deeper into the reality, the people that left basically left because they wanted something better. And 47% of them left without a job to go to. But what is fascinating is that they've subsequently gone back to work of some type. So it's not I'm leaving the labour market, it's just I don't like this one. What is slightly weird is that 21% actually went back into a similar job in a similar industry. But interestingly, only because they were able to get greater flexibility or more money or a reasonable workload from a different employer. Now, what is most interesting, which I find fascinating, is, we normally talk about employees are on probation. In one survey, it's interesting. Sorry, the reason I'm laughing is you'll find this funny. 25% of people who return to work have said that their employer is on 6 months probation. And if their expectations are not met, they're going to leave. And if you look at the next slide, that shows quite clearly that this is a reshuffle more than a resignation, that actually there is a significant percentage of people. And the left-hand column is why they left. But the right-hand column is even more interesting. It's the fact that they are happy to leave again, even if they don't have a job. But let's look at why did they leave in the first place? And that's interesting. So, you know, there's some studies that show key factors were uncaring leaders, 35%, unsustainable workloads, 35%, lack of advancement potential, 35%, lack of meaningful work, 35%, named as factors. But what is really interesting is the next slide, which shows that employers do not think their people left for the same reason that the people actually did leave. This is from McKinsey. So on the left-hand side is what employees said they left for. On the right-hand side is what the employers think they left for. And it's interesting that the employers say, no, these people left because they were ill. And some of those things have effectively remove any responsibility from the employer. Now, you know, for those of you that are listening on tablets or mobile phones, you will not be able to see that at all. But it's from McKinsey. And it's really interesting. But the next slide summarizes those inconsistencies, and I think it's about the sort of quality of leadership that we're seeing. And you know, it's above all, it's about the fact that your boss has a very significant impact on you know, why you're leaving or staying. And I think the graphic there has sort of flipped slightly in translation. So what employees have been saying is, I'm leaving because I'm not valued by my boss. I have no sense of belonging. I don't feel valued by the organization. I don't see any advancement potential. And I'm not really feeling caring or trust from the team. And, you know, that's what's getting to me. Now, what employers are saying employees left for is because they weren't getting enough money. They weren't very well. They were looking for a better job. They weren't getting development, and we weren't giving them remote working. The common factors between both employees and the employers are, interestingly, not enough flexible work, too much work being done, and not having a good work-life balance, people not being engaged at work, and the employer not really caring about your family, you know, linked to work-life balance. So what I think is really interesting there is that employers are not getting it. They are somehow rationalizing that people are leaving from completely different reasons that they really are leaving from. And I think this just goes back to the sort of fundamentals of why there's a problem. It's about this quality of leadership that I think we've seen earlier. You know, your boss has a significant impact on your engagement in terms of whether you go and whether you stay. And as we saw from Gallup, you know, engagement has dropped. Now, even if we take that 32% figure, you know, that's the good news to some degree. The problem is that the data, if you look at that chart, said that there are 17% who are actively disengaged. What does that mean? That means basically they don't care. They come to work, do the minimum, take the money and go home. Now, if you then work out the figures, that leaves 51% in the middle who aren't really sure. Sometimes they care, sometimes they don't necessarily care. So this poses some significant questions about the current quality of leadership in our organizations, and I think what we need to do about it, because we have to develop leaders better to ensure people are engaged to stay. Now, for information, as a side point, for the best employers, engagement rates are around 70%. But it's also not just about your boss, it's about your wider organization enabling your boss to allow you to do their best. So there has to be a positive sort of we, not me culture, and that's down to C-suite. But what is interesting is, people are saying, oh, this is new, this is great resignation. No, we've known this for years. Let me give you a quote. Pleasure in the job puts perfection in the work. Now, that's a pretty clear statement of employee engagement. Who said that? Branson? No. Jobs? No. Aristotle, 2,500 years ago. Because fundamentally, what we are thinking about up here, what we want from our jobs, what we want from our lives hasn't changed in 2,500 years. So this isn't new. And really, we should have got it by now. So what can we do about it? I think that even if we weren't doing what we should have been doing before COVID, it's now a chance to make our organizations a great place to work for people so they want to stay and give their best. And how can we do that? So I think there are 6 simple steps. The first of which is we have to think of our people holistically. Proactively recognize that work is not their whole lives, and actually maybe show an interest in the rest of their lives. You know, it's called showing you care. Then it's about, the next one is maximum flexibility. And that's what we alluded to in the questions. It's about how can we give the individual the maximum amount of flexibility within the context of delivering the job and ensuring the effectiveness of the team. So optimized hybrid working balanced to the needs of the individual, the team, and the organization. Now, that might include a 4-day working week where it can be implemented. Okay, with the 4-day working week, there are places where it won't necessarily work easily, but it can be made to work. On that, it might mean that in areas of low profit margins, people have to accept that if they have more time off, they might not get paid as much. But then again, if we look at Gen Z, they might be perfectly happy to do that. Leaders leading and not managing. You know, people in leadership roles need to lead day to day, not just by managing. They need to know their people. They need to build trust. They need to coach and develop. And they need to tailor that job as much as possible to the individual. It goes to the age-old line, know your people. But have things changed? And what is interesting is I don't believe they have. Let me give you an example. Before COVID and since COVID, I speak to groups of leaders at their corporate events, at professional bodies, and I always ask the question, based on your experience of your own bosses, what they've done, what you've seen around you, what are the things that you think leaders should be doing every day to get the best from their people? Now, I've been doing that for over 10 years. And interestingly, what they say, irrespective of sector, location, culture, or age, is consistent. It's 12 to 14 key actions, and they're all obvious to all of you. We all know about them. It's the listening, the telling people what's going on, the developing their career, showing you care, building trust and transparency, telling them how what they do contributes to the big picture, understanding people make genuine mistakes. But when I now ask people post-COVID if there's anything else they need to do, the answer is no. We just need to do it better. Interesting that thinking about it, the devil is in the detail. This next slide shows this simply. This is Gen Z is significantly more focused on the importance of things such as meaningful work, good work environment, flexibility, leaders who care, and working as a team. Now that's 20% of our current workforce. But I think we overemphasize how much difference there is between the generations. I think everybody wants those things, but I think the generational difference is that Gen Z will walk out if they don't get them. And perhaps another practical example of how this can work is that a few years ago, I helped a house construction company encourage and enable their leaders to look at those simple actions that they could do day to day on that list over a period of 18 months more effectively. So it wasn't the strategic, it was just tell people what's going on, ask for ideas, support them, show you care, and so on. The proof was, within 2 years, the number of people who would recommend that company to friends or family as a great place to work rose from 42% to 81%. I believe that that shows if you get this right, not only will your people give their best and they'll stay, but interestingly also, they will potentially proactively find you good quality candidates from amongst their friends and family, which is exactly what you need now. And not only that, it could add 10% to your bottom line for free. So the other thing is, we spoke about SMEs. And one of the things that SMEs find difficult is to compete against larger organizations in terms of fringe benefits. But the one thing that SMEs can do are these simple leadership actions that I've just mentioned, because we all know about them, anyone can do them, and they don't cost any money. Then what's the next thing I think we all need to do more of? It's just live the values and purpose every day. You know, get it into the culture. Have it exemplified by leaders and senior leaders. Have it built into business decisions that truly reflect values, and create this we, not me culture, rather than the me, not we culture that sometimes happens. And again, I just want to emphasize the point, because this matters. 42% of Gen Z would work for less money in a job with a clear purpose. And then back up to that C-suite point, I think, leading by example. Because C-suite sets the tone, and C-suite puts the support in place that enables other leaders to get the best. You know, remote working. Who allows remote working? The C-suite to some degree. And line managers down the organization can do their best. But if C-suite don't support it, all you've got is islands of excellence in a sea of mediocrity. And that's not going to deliver you organizational success. You know, the evidence is clear. But interestingly, if C-suite do positive actions to advance this agenda, it has a multiplier effect on the actions of good leaders across the organization. If they act negatively, they degrade the impact of all the other leaders in the organization. But again, perception is all. You know, there was a great piece of data that said in November 2020, one survey found 80% of C-suite said they were supporting the emotional and physical needs of their people well. Strangely, when the people were asked, only 46% said they were. So C-suite maybe needs to listen a little bit more. And then recruitment expectation management, I think we're getting not as good as, it's not as good as it could be. You know, but interestingly, there's also evidence of resignation regret. I mean, the job site Muse found that 70% of people who moved jobs said that the job they moved to didn't live up to expectations, and 42% of them would have gone back to their original job. Now, whether that's about the new employer not delivering on promises, or it's about people's unrealistic expectations, I don't know, that's maybe open to debate. But if you as a leader and an organization can honestly put your hand on your heart and say, we've done the best we can, then, you know, maybe you need to ask the question, if people aren't happy, would they be better working in some other form of employment? You know, not just for you, but for them as well. And I've literally frequently had that conversation with CEOs and HRDs of tech and digital organizations that are saying, we've got someone who just wants so much flexibility, we can't do it. And I just say, if you can't do it, if it's not possible to run an organization with people doing that, then they can't do it. It's that simple. The future. I believe, as well as a rethink, we're in a rebalancing period where we're trying to assimilate everything that's happened. We're trying to learn to be better, both for organizations and people. But if you want to succeed, you can't let up on improving in these key areas to make your organization a great place to work. Why? Not only because of the engagement data, but also because there's a Gen Z time bomb under the surface. Don't forget, Gen Z are now 20% of the workforce, but by 2030, they'll be 40%. And as we've seen, they have high expectations, and many would just walk out of a bad job even if they didn't have another one to go to, unlike previous generations. Now, okay, some people have suggested that Gen Z will massively change their perceptions and principles as they get older and become more realistic. My view is that that's unlikely to any degree. But if you're in an organization that believes that, you just carry on as before, and time will tell who's right. But what's really important, I think, as we finish, is that please think about everything I've said and think about 3 actions that you can go and do after this event to make a difference. And finally, I'd say maybe the Great Resignation isn't just the Great Resignation. It is the Great Rethink for both you, me, organizations, and other people. And even in this conversation, we've just talked about people as employees and leaders. Don't forget, we haven't even touched on the perspectives that people have in their actions as customers, investors, and members of wider society, because COVID has also impacted how we think and act in those roles, which then drives the way we interact with organizations. So it's a feedback loop. Also, I think in COVID perhaps has interacted positively, maybe in the way we act together as a society. Maybe UK is more cohesive than it was, maybe more tolerant, I don't know. But I think the lesson is that this rethink has shown us that we can be better as people, can be better as teams and as organizations, if we think of each other as individual human beings, if we respect our differences and leverage that diversity in all its glory and in all its breadth. So maybe the true benefit that we can get out of the tragedy that has been COVID is that this great rethink has made us not just rethink our work, but it's made us rethink our lives and what they truly mean, and that's made us all better. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Chris. Really, really interesting, of value. Clearly, there were lots of questions in the chat, but it was really exciting listening to you and your examples. So on behalf of the CMI, I really want to thank you. And I'm sure the audience are grateful. I think there's a lot of food for thought, even for myself, in terms of, staff working remotely, staff coming to the office. So thank you ever so much. And I'll go to Michael, if that's okay.
I just say very, very quickly, please, if anybody wants to connect on LinkedIn, do so. And if you want to pick up on some points about this that successful leaders have come up with from across the world, check out my podcast, Perspectives from the Top. Just Google Perspectives from the Top.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Michael?
That's great. Thank you so much, Dilshad. And that is it for today's session. So I want to extend a very special thank you to all of you who've joined us. Thank you, of course, to Professor Dilshad, our host this evening, and also to Chris Roebuck for your insight and expertise. Don't forget, if you are a member of CMI, you can log into Management Direct using the link in the live chat, and you can find a wide range of exclusive and practical development resources and much more. And if you're not yet a member or a subscriber, you can join our community via the link that's also in the live chat to gain full access to our Management Direct portal. You can also sign up to the free CMI newsletter for the latest trends and tips for managers and leaders. Please do take a few moments to let us know your thoughts on today's event by completing the evaluation form, and the link for that is also in the live chat. So thank you once again for joining us, and do enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care.
Bye.